Yes, I will talk about Luffincott Rectory, but I will talk about some other things as well, because Luffincott, a fascinating case though it is, wouldn't fill an entire talk on its own. So I've selected some other bits and pieces of Devon stuff that kind of complement various aspects of the case in different ways, and we'll cover those as we go along. As Claire said in that introduction, I created and host the Folklore Podcast, and I am the curator of the Folklore Library and Archive, which is a volunteer-led, donation-driven organisation which looks to preserve for the future folklore materials in various different forms. I am the author of these 3 books: Black Dog Folklore, which looks at spectral apparitions of ghostly black dogs in British and world folklore; Telling the Bees and Other Customs, which is a book about the folklore of rural crafts; and Dark Folklore, which is co-authored with my wife Tracy, which looks at some of, as you would expect, the darker aspects of folklore, some of which will come up in the talk this evening. All of those books are available from the Folklore Podcast website by going to the Folklore shop on there. That's the plug for how I make money. Right, good. Now, before we start on looking at any ghost cases at all, I just want to look at how we approach ghosts in terms of folklore, because it's a little bit different to how we approach them in terms of paranormal investigation. Now, when we examine stories of ghosts in folklore, we need to be mindful that they split down into 2 kind of distinct categories, really. There are the alleged sightings of ghosts, such as you might go out and investigate, and there are what we might term folk ghosts. So in the case of the former ones, there are reports with details which you can investigate, names and dates and third-party involvement and those sorts of things. And the incident might not have happened in the very recent past, but it hasn't yet been consigned to history. In the latter category, the category of folk ghosts, those things tend to have happened, and those are the cases which we tend to examine more in terms of folklore, we being folklorists in this case. Now, obviously, with many things in life and with virtually everything in folklore, it's not really quite as clear-cut as that. We're used within folklore to looking at the idea of boundaries, the liminal state where things are neither one thing nor the other, where the edges are indistinct and blurred, and that exists as well in terms of stories of ghosts and spirits. So let's start by saying what exactly is a folk ghost, if you like? Well, to answer that question, really, we need to think about what a ghost is in terms of folklore. Now, that might appear at first glance to be quite a straightforward question. What is a ghost? Well, the ghost is the apparition of a previously living being. There you go, end of dictionary definition, job done. But actually, the composition of the symbol, and in terms of folklore, we look at symbols all the time, because everything inherently has no meaning without kind of that aspect to it. The term ghost is a bit more fluid than that, and that's due in part to our understanding of symbols and the way that they might vary in terms of time and place and culture and things like that. So in folk-based stories of ghosts, for example, the ghost itself often replaces a motif which came earlier on, but which had similar characteristics. David Clarke, folklorist and UFO researcher, noted in his work that in texts from medieval England, for example, people were very much afraid of revenants, so creatures who would emerge from their grave at night and spread death and disease before them. In later times, ghosts often replaced those revenants in terms of the source of the fear in a particular story or location. But belief in the destructive elements that the revenants, the undead, carried with them, those continue along similar lines in the later stories. Devon folklore scholar Theo Brown made a similar suggestion to this in terms of fairies, for example, fairies being the remnants of lost prehistoric races. And she discussed that idea in her book, Devon Ghosts. That's of less use in this discussion than one of her other books, The Fate of the Dead, where she makes a number of observations on the idea of the folkloric or the folk ghost. I've mentioned the first of those already. There's no first-hand accounts of experiences of these particular ghosts. The stories of those ghosts come from written records or from oral retellings. Folklore is all about telling stories, after all. Secondly, folk ghosts are based on the memory of a person who actually existed, and in most cases can be identified by name. So with a lot of these legendary hauntings, the person involved stands out over other people in the community because they have some sense of power about them normally. Now, that power could take different forms. It could be financial power, they're particularly wealthy. It could be because they were particularly unpleasant in character, and that's very common in terms of folkloric ghost stories, or it might be that they were powerful intellectually. And in those stories, often it's particular trades or professions which have this intellectual superiority over others: millers, tailors, inventors, things like that. Whatever the reason, the innate abilities that the person has cause them to stand out over other people in the community. Population inevitably then becomes hostile towards them because they're essentially jealous of what they can do. But they're too formidable a character to be able to tackle head on in life. So they wait till they've died and then they get their vengeance then. And that's how these stories come about. Now, the ghosts of these characters would usually appear in their own form, but in some cases within folklore, then the ghosts appear in other ways, often as animals. The final aspect, really, in terms of folk ghosts, which is important, is that their hauntings are rarely benign. So in these stories, the peace in a community is broken by the ghost in some way. And that shouldn't appear surprising when you consider the point that everybody is hostile to these people because of their skills or the way that they are. A powerful figure would most likely want to exact some form of revenge for all of the jealousy or the character assassination against them, rather than just sitting back and taking it and going, yeah, well, that's all right, isn't it? The ongoing disruption in that case in folklore leads to some kind of religious leader or a scholar having to intervene and then having to banish the ghost in order to restore normality. And that could be by consigning them to a remote area. And we often hear stories of ghosts being consigned to the Red Sea, for example, within folklore, or by some other means, by laying the ghost, by reading it down into a box and then burying it, that sort of thing. So by way of illustration of that, we'll start with another Devon story. All of the stories that I'm going to cover in this come from my area. And this is the story of a weaver named Knowles, who lived in a village called Dean Combe, which is in the south of Devon, an area that was known for its cloth manufacture, in fact. And Knowles was said to be one of the finest weavers in the area, who consistently produced the best material. So because of these skills, Knowles becomes a very rich man, but he's not very generous with his wealth. And alongside that, he's a bit of a selfish gossip and a bit kind of nasty character. So he becomes hated by his neighbours. So there we go. There's all the aspects of a folk ghost story. Knowles worked from sunrise to sunset each day, eventually dying whilst sat at his loom. The loom was in the loft of the house. Now, despite being ill-liked in the parish, the funeral was held and quite a few people came, probably just to make sure that he'd actually gone, or possibly to wish well to his son rather than anything else. His son, Fernley, was a much more pleasant and more respected person within the community. He would now have to prove, as the son of this master weaver, that he had the skills that his father had taught him. So some time passes, the funeral comes and goes, and then the next day, the son, Fernley, knows that he has to start work. So he descends to the kitchen to light the fires and have some breakfast, and then is going to go up to the loft to start work at the loom. So while he's down at the table having breakfast, he's shocked to hear the familiar sound of the loom thumping away up in the loft. So he creeps upstairs to investigate, thinking that maybe somebody's broken into the house. He pushes the door slightly ajar, peers through the gap, but something unexpected meets his eyes, and there, sat at the loom, is the ghost of his father, the old weaver, working away as he always did in life. So Fernley is alarmed and confused and doesn't know what to do. So he fetches the local vicar, as they always do in these stories. The vicar comes to the house, thinking he's going to have to employ the traditional bell, book and candle. But when he gets there, the vicar stays on the ground floor and shouts up the stairs to the weaver to leave the property and to return to his proper place, that now being in his grave. "I will as soon as I finish this quill," cries out the spirit of Knowles, the weaver, in something of an unearthly voice. The priest again commands the spirit to leave the house and return to the graveyard, and this time the spirit does indeed come downstairs. At this point, the vicar throws holy water in its face and recites a prayer, and the weaver, with a scream, is transformed into a ghostly black dog. Through the use of the Bible, then, the priest brings the dog to heel and commands it to follow him, where he takes it into the local woods, banishes the spirit to an endless task, gives it an acorn shell, which he picks up from the ground by the oak tree, gives it to the dog, and says he can only find eternal rest when he's emptied the pool in the woods using the acorn shell. And legend obviously still says that the local people will not visit the pool at noon or midnight, 12 o'clock boundary times between night and day, because they'll see the image of this ghastly black dog trying to empty the pool with its acorn shell. So that's an example of a typical folk ghost story. All of the elements are in there of what you would expect to hear. The other side of that, obviously, is the normal traditional sighting of a ghost, which can be explored. Now, Luffincott Rectory is an interesting case because it kind of takes on aspects of both, and I'm going to leave it down to you to decide what exactly was going on with this case. And I've called this Devon's Borley for a couple of reasons, one being that it is obviously the tale of a haunted rectory. Now, it's not quite on the scale of Borley, the most haunted house in England, end quote, obviously, but certainly it is of much interest, if maybe in slightly different ways. So Luffincott Rectory was in the parish of Luffincott in West Devon, about 6 miles to the south of Holsworthy, if anybody knows the area. It's a tiny place. It had a population in 2001, according to the census, of 45 people. So it's a proper hamlet. And Luffincott Rectory was intended to be the home of the serving vicar of this building, St. James's Church, now declared redundant. It's been redundant since 1975. In fact, it's now owned and operated by the church's Conservation Trust. And the rectory sat half a mile to the east. And as far as I know, this is the only known photograph of the rectory, which was turned into a postcard. Now, key to the story of Luffincott, as you will know if you were here right at the beginning when CJ alluded to it, is this character, the Reverend Frank Parker. He served as rector at Luffincott for about 45 years, from 1835 until his death. He wasn't a typical poor country vicar, as a lot of people were at the time in the cloth. He was actually quite wealthy. He farmed the glebe in the area. He kept a good number of staff, both working the land and serving as staff at the rectory. He seems to have treated them pretty well, in fact, and he used to give the traditional harvest home celebration for his farm workers every year at the glebe and provide them with food and drink and thank them for their troubles and so on. And his strong financial position allowed him to rebuild and subsequently to enlarge Luffincott Rectory over the years. Now, Parker died in 1880 as a bachelor, and his body was buried outside the east window of the church. Now, according to another vicar, the Reverend Norman McGee, writing about this case in 1959, he says that Parker was said to have been very happy at Luffincott, and the saying goes that he was wont to express a wish that no successor should ever dispossess him of what he had come to regard as his own. Now, after Reverend Parker's death, other vicars came and went until the arrival of the Reverend Thomas Ward Brown. Now, Reverend Brown was a fairly stout man with a small pointed beard, and he was known for wearing the kind of stereotypical broad-brimmed hat which priests at that time traditionally wore. And he had a notable way of walking with his head down. And this was due to the fact that he was partly paralyzed. Now, Reverend Brown was far more impoverished than the preceding vicar, Reverend Parker. He chose to live at the rectory with no staff, nobody else at all, in very kind of cheap means, if you like. Now, at some point around the year 1901, Reverend Brown was sitting down to his evening meal in the rectory on his own, as usual, and reading a book as he ate. Glancing up, he saw what he described later as the ghost of Frank Parker standing before him. He didn't recognize him as such at the time, but he later managed to ascribe to the ghost the identity. Now, if the story as it's related by the Reverend McGee is to be believed, Reverend Brown was so terrified by this that he immediately upped and fled and left the rectory. And he went to the nearby village of Clawton, which was the place where he previously held the position of curate. And he sought sanctuary there from the farmer with whom he'd lived while he was working there. He was never again to return to Luffincott Rectory, and he wouldn't allow any of his possessions to be retrieved. Even if his half-finished meal, says the story, remained on the table in the rectory. Brown carried on his tenure here for another 2 years, but he continued to live at Clawton. Now, some sources say that he was taken to the church every Sunday by his landlord in a pony and trap. But most sources say that he walked the 4.5 miles each way, dressed in his cassock, ready for service. Now, if that's the case, that would have been quite a feat, because remember, this is somebody who was described as being partly paralyzed. And it was said that between delivering the morning service and evensong, he would eat his lunch in the church porch. Over time, Luffincott Rectory naturally developed a reputation for its haunting. Local residents there decided that if the Reverend Brown didn't want all of his possessions that he'd abandoned there, well, then they shouldn't go to waste. So gradually, they removed them. People began to break the windows of the property in order to gain access and stay the night there to see what was going on. And the building fell into a poor state of repair until finally, and this is the other reason that I refer to it as Devon's Borley, it burned down. Whether that was accidental or whether it was deliberate remains a question for which we will now never have an answer. Now, some people didn't think that there was anything remotely supernatural about Luffincott at all. In a newspaper clipping, which I think comes from the 1960s, but is otherwise unsourced, the case is discussed by a gentleman called Frederick Lyle. Now, he was 13 at the time of this incident, and he recalls that the Reverend Brown was a very timid and easily frightened man. Lyle suggests that the night that he fled the rectory was, in fact, the only night that Reverend Brown ever stayed there at all. But Lyle says that the incident took place not when the Reverend Brown was eating his meal, but when he was lying in bed. The ghost was, according to Lyle, nothing more than a couple of local lads who draped themselves in a white sheet and crept into the bedroom. And the easily frightened parson was so terrified that he fled the building without even getting dressed. Lyle believed that the whole story of the ghost probably came from Frank Parker's request just before his death, the request that they should, quote, bury me 6 feet deep so that I should never rise again, end quote. Now that might sound like something of a dramatic request, but we need to consider this alongside the suggestion put forward by some people that the Reverend Parker was what is known in the Southwest as a conjuring parson. And this is the point at which the story really diverts in two ways. Up until now, it's very much a case that in some respects could be investigated through historical sources and looking at the area and the fact it's not that long ago in history. But here it also takes a turn into something which is a little bit more folkloric. Now, we find the figure of conjuring parsons in quite a few places within English folklore, but down here in Devon, the idea is particularly strong. These were men who blurred the boundaries between the Christian church, Christian preachers, and what we might term folk magicians. Some of them were thought to have magical libraries and to be able to perform various acts of astrology or divination, or sometimes even more fantastical feats. What we should actually consider these people to be probably are exorcists. At least they were often called upon to banish restless spirits or to lay them down. And these ghost-laying parsons in folklore usually acted in groups, usually 9 or 12. They were usually said to be trained at Oxford University and preferably were learned in Latin or in Greek or Hebrew or a similar language. And the parsons might banish spirits in a magic circle, which was known as a galley trap or lob's pound. These could be invisible, or sometimes they were marked out on the floor with bands of iron, which were taken from barrels. Because obviously within folklore, it's believed that spirits and fairies cannot cross or pass iron. The clergyman, it was said, could protect himself from harm by being in the presence of a pregnant woman or a baby, because it was also believed that spirits would not harm the innocent. And spirits could be banished by throwing consecrated graveyard earth, which was believed to absorb the bodies of the dead and was therefore doubly potent. Now, actually, when we look across folklore in the UK generally at this, it's not just Oxford University that these conjuring parsons might be trained at, but they certainly had to be learned. In the case of one in Cornwall, for example, John Rudall, he was educated at Cambridge. But in Devon, Oxford was the preferred institution. Now, there could be a couple of reasons for this. Logically, one could be down to close ties between Oxford and one of the major cities in Devon, Exeter, specifically through the establishing of the Bodleian Library and Exeter College at Oxford. The other might be simply because there are other significant folk ghosts in the county who were said to have been banished by Oxford men after those from Cambridge had tried and failed. For example, there was a ghost, the ghost of Mr. Lydd in Sidmouth, a penitential spirit of a man who was rumoured to have murdered his uncle, and was laid to rest by a Mr. George Cornish of Pascombe, who was an Oxford scholar, after 6 Cambridge-educated ministers had failed at the task. Anyway, back to Luffincott. The Reverend J.G.M. Scott, writing in 1960, in response to a published article about this case, notes that he was told by a female parishioner that her grandmother used to speak of Reverend Frank Parker's conjuring reputation. And it was said by the grandmother that they used to say that he could turn himself into a lion or a snake or a wolf. And once he stopped in the middle of his sermon at Luffincott and rushed home because he said that his maids back in the rectory were looking at his books and he knew that he had to go back and stop them. Now, this reputation of practicing magical acts as well as Christian ones was ascribed to some members of the clergy, not because they actually had that arcane knowledge, but because they were easily the most educated person in the surrounding area. Think back to the earlier description of folk ghosts and the most intellectually advanced or significant people then becoming spirits later. Or sometimes it was ascribed to them because they were especially eccentric. Now, Reverend Parker wasn't considered to be particularly eccentric, but he was incumbent at Luffincott for a long time, some 45 years. That suggests he was probably pretty good at what he did. But the story of the maids and the books, for example, knowing that that's going on and having to leave and stop them, isn't unique in terms of folklore. And in fact, you could recognize it as being a variation of a very well-known story, this one, The Sorcerer's Apprentice. It's not the only version that's found in Devon of this story, for example. So in the Folklore Journal in 1954, Sir W.R. Halliday tells the same story being related to him by another Reverend, C.E. Glover, about a man called William Gimmingham, who was the rector of Bratton Fleming in Devon between 1820 and 1837. And in this article, it's said about William Gimmingham, one story about him is that while he was in church, his maids got hold of his books of magic, with the result that they were infested with crowds of fowls, which the rector spirited away. It's not brooms and buckets of water, but again, it's very similar. In the case of Gimmingham, stories are likely to have come about because of the eccentricity element, in fact. Another story about him said that he once saw a man outside his house stealing his vegetables, so he cast a spell on him, rendering him unable to move until the vicar reversed it. He was said to leave his church during services if he became bored in order to go outside and smoke a pipe in the churchyard. He also had a black dog, not a ghostly one, but an actual one, that went to church with him. He once left a handwritten note in the parish marriage register, which was witnessed by 2 other people, stating that in a time of drought, he had prophesied that it would rain within 24 hours, and it did. Now, the church has always had an interesting relationship between magic and superstition. And these conjuring parson stories kind of demonstrate that this line between magic and religion can often become very blurred. There are other examples in Devon. Parson Joe, down here in the southwest, recorded astrological calculations in his notebook, and he took these on behalf of the parishioners. The church might have frowned upon this, but he believed that it was part of his responsibility in caring for his flock to do it. Now, we know that the Reverend Parker was said to have had this magical library. He was also, according to one person, discovered in bed one day surrounded by dead toads. Now, toads feature very prominently in witch folklore down here in the southwest and in many other places, obviously. I want to talk a little bit about toads in terms of folklore. So there's a story from Cambridgeshire, for example, from the 17th century, of a man who stole a communion wafer and was later caught urinating against the side of the church whilst holding the communion wafer in his hand. Why? Well, he'd been told that if he did this, a toad would appear and eat the wafer, after which the man would be endowed with the powers of a witch. Now, various parts of the churches as buildings have been used in many ways over the years for traditions or activities which fall outside of the normal Christian ones. They're said to have a particular power which can be utilized in terms of helping with spell casting and also with creating charms to destroy the power of what used to be called black witches or maleficent witchcraft, for example. So there's a local working involving toad magic, for example, which is illustrated on screen here, where you gather 3 stone jars together and 3 frogs' livers and 3 toad hearts. And the livers you stick with pins, the hearts you stick with thorns from a holy thorn bush, probably in the churchyard. And each of these you put in a stone jar. You then visit 3 graveyards. You bury 1 jar in the path of each one at a particular depth and a particular distance from the church porch. And it was believed that anyone undertaking this ritual was thereafter immune from the evil influence of witches. It's a kind of thing that you think in terms of folklore is something that's probably been recorded, but there's no evidence for. But in fact, jars such as this with hearts and livers in them have been dug up within the boundaries of churches in the area, and these are recorded in the transactions of the Devonshire Association, for example. I'll tell you another unusual ghost story about a church down here, and or the grounds of a church, and that's this one, the Church of St Bartholomew, which is in Yelmpton, 4 Street in Yelmpton. It's a Grade 2 listed building. Rebuilt in 1850 by William Butterfield. The tower was added in 1915, and it's got a particularly impressive interior, this church, with black and white marble. The outside of the church isn't particularly noteworthy. At least it wouldn't be if it wasn't for a particular story relating to the path which runs up to the church door, which apparently took place in 1947 and was first reported on in the Devonshire Association transactions in 1975. It hasn't been widely revisited since that time. It's just an odd story. The vicar at the time here was the Reverend Alfred Biles. He'd taken up the position the year previously, so that would have been 1946, and had located there with his wife. On the Saturday afternoon when this took place, she was in the church arranging altar flowers, ready for the service the following morning. The vicar needed to speak to her about something, so he headed up the churchyard path towards the door in the south side of the chancel, when he suddenly came across a hole in the middle of the path, a roughly shaped hole about a yard across. Reverend Biles thought it was probably some sort of sinkhole brought about by subsidence. He mentioned it to his wife when he went into the church. When he went out again a short while later and took the same route back down the path, the hole had increased greatly in size. So he went back in to fetch his wife to have a look at it. They both came out, looked into the hole, which seemed to be quite deep. In fact, Reverend Biles considered lowering himself down to investigate. He wasn't sure actually how far this hole went down, so he threw a stone into it. The stone bumped against stonework, which was visible from the path. According to the vicar, he thought it looked as if it might form part of a well. He recorded the story later on and said, "My main concern was to prevent an accident to anyone using the path. I therefore went away to get some planks to cover the hole, which measured about 3 yards across. In the village street, I met Mr. Knight, the local builder and undertaker, and asked him to come and see the hole. On arrival, there was no sign of a hole. The path and the grass verges were exactly as before, with no sign of disturbance. Mr. Knight seemed rather less puzzled than I expected and said, "That's all right, sir," or words to that effect, and he never mentioned the incident again. Alfred Byles remained vicar of St. Bartholomew's for 3 years or so before leaving for London in 1950, and there are no further reports of this hole being mentioned at all. In 1985, the story was picked up for the TV programme Arthur C. Clarke's World of Strange Powers, despite the fact that there is no apparent power, strange or otherwise, connected with this hole. And the Reverend Byles was filmed back in his old parish, indicating with his walking stick where the hole had been observed. After that, again, there seems to be no further mention of the story. So what actually happened in 1947? Did a hole open up and then disappear again? The comments made by the builder, Mr. Knight, could be taken one of two ways. Either he was being mysterious and he didn't want to appear puzzled because he knew something about the hole that the vicar didn't. Or alternatively, he was just placating the vicar because he thought he might have come across as a bit delusional. Both meanings could be read into those 4 words. That's all right, sir. Some people might suggest that Reverend Byles made the story up and that his wife supported him because she apparently also saw the hole. Fair enough. But if that's the case, why? There's little to gain from doing so. There's an associated risk of perhaps coming across a bit strangely or eccentric or odd. There's no perceived need for publicity for the church, like you might find in a ghost appearing in a pub or some other haunted property, which would involve increased business. So what happened? Don't know. It's an unusual and unclear story. It's a story which has no apparent logic to it. We'll probably be looking into the Yelpton hole for some time. Other stories which have more obvious aspects to them in terms of why they might take place are poltergeist stories. Now, traditionally, obviously, poltergeist happenings took place within Borley. They didn't especially take place within Luffincott, but there are other stories from the area which do involve poltergeists, and I was going to highlight a couple of those which are particularly interesting. One historic, but one modern, about which very little is known, but about which some people might want to look into at some point. Now, poltergeist cases are far more rare in terms of folklore than ghosts which walk abroad. And that accounts for the perceived low numbers of them here in Devon and elsewhere. There might, of course, be many events which take place, which are representative of poltergeists, but which are just simply never recorded. We don't know. And a friend of mine used to live in a cottage in a village not too far from here. And he told us one day when we were visiting some examples of unusual things which he'd witnessed in the building, which had hallmarks of poltergeist phenomena, you know, cupboards opening, things flying out, that sort of stuff. But they were never told in a way that they'd be passed on by request. It was just a story that he told. They'll never enter any kind of historic record in terms more detailed than the way that I describe it there. One of the most definitive and at the time particularly controversial Devon records of poltergeist manifestation took place in the village of Sandford Peveril in East Devon. Here's a picture of Sandford Peveril just because it looks nice. This case took place for a prolonged period of time from 1810 onwards. In the July of the previous year, 1809, the owner of a property, Mr. Talley, rented it out to John Chave and his wife. Mrs. Chave's brother, who was aged around 20, also lived with the couple at this address. The family were quite well established in the area. John Chave ran a not unsubstantial shop in the village, for example. The Chaves, therefore, also had staff living at the property to support them. 2 maids, one elderly, one aged about 13, an apprentice, and a cooper who worked from the shed at the property. Seemingly supernatural activity began in the house around April of 1810 in the form of loud banging both at night and during the day. This appeared to have some sort of agency to it. When people in the house stamped their feet, for example, the unseen banging would respond in a like fashion, only more loudly than before. These noises went on for about 5 weeks or so, after which time the phenomena escalated further, and the 2 maids, along with 2 other women, experienced what they termed physical attacks from unseen hands, which left them with varying injuries. The case started to receive a lot of local attention, as you would expect, and many people were visiting the property. And among these were the eponymous vicar, because there is always a vicar, the Reverend Charles Caleb Colton, who came from the nearby town of Tiverton, and who published 2 pamphlets on the story. In the first of these pamphlets, he describes some of the violence which took place in the property. He says, the blows given differ in violence. At times, they can be compared to nothing but a very strong man striking with the greatest force he is master of, with a closed fist on the bed. They leave a great soreness and visible marks. I saw a swelling at least as big as a turkey's egg on the cheek of Anne Mills. She voluntarily made oath that she was alone in the bed when she received the blow that caused that protuberance from some invisible hand. Now, he then goes on to describe some of the other physical manifestations which accompanied these attacks, including when the women were given an attempt at protection and sometimes witnessed by other people. He wrote, I've seen a sword, when placed in the hands of some of these women, repeatedly and violently wrested out of them after the space of a few minutes and thrown with a very loud noise, sometimes into the middle of the room, sometimes still more violently against the wall. This sword I have heard it take up and with it beat the bed, by it shaking the handle in a particular manner. I have been aware of its taking it up. I have placed a large Greek folio testament weighing about 8 or 9 pounds on the bed. It has been repeatedly thrown into the centre of the room. I have often heard the curtains of the bed most violently agitated, accompanied with a loud and almost indescribable motion of the ring. On one occasion, there was from the moon a sufficient degree of light to see this motion, and at the same time, clearly to ascertain that the cause, whatever it might be, was something invisible. Now, the views of the vicar, Mr. Colton, held little sway with Mr. Marriott. Mr. Marriott was the editor of the Taunton Courier, a local newspaper. Colton had originally intended to publish his findings in the newspaper through a series of letters, but then he realized that they were just too substantial. The newspaper did publish on the subject of the Sandford Peveril haunting, but they went in this way. They wrote, the Taunton Courier of Thursday contains the following pleasant account of this precious piece of imposition. The editor, in his next paper, it is hoped, will be able to inform the public the precise amount of the very considerable sum of money which the Reverend Mr. Colton has pledged himself to bestow on the poor of his parish whenever the affair should have been proved to have originated in human agency. This promise must not be forgotten. It may be useful for the editor to know that in various places on the coast it has been no uncommon practice for smugglers to give out that certain houses have been haunted by evil spirits, and it really might be of some service in the elucidation of the affair if the excise officer was to take a peep into the same hollow depth about which the owner knows nothing? Did not the ghost amuse himself in terrifying the females who sleep in the house? One should not object so much to his taste in refusing to appear when male visitors were there. But if his gallantry be disputable, his prudence must be allowed to be unquestionable, a quality not always discoverable in these grim visitors. It's flowery language, but essentially it's a load of rubbish. So there's a load of toing and froing between the vicar and the editor in the paper, which becomes increasingly acrimonious. And it leads to Colton publishing the second pamphlet in the September of 1810 to enlarge upon his discoveries at the property. Now, the somewhat scathing commentary by Mr. Marriott in the newspaper does include a couple of interesting points. He refers to a very considerable sum of money, which Colton has offered to pay to anyone, if anyone can prove that the supernatural activity is happening thanks to human hands. Now, that money was never claimed, despite the disruption apparently continuing for another 3 years after this point. In defiance, it says, of a reward of £250 to be given to anyone who can produce such information as may lead to a discovery. Now, £250 at this time is a significant amount of money, but it remains unclaimed. The second point of interest is Marriott's mention of the fact that ghost stories are often the invention of smugglers who used them to keep people away from areas where they were moving or concealing goods, for example. And there are certainly lots of examples around the coasts of Britain of hauntings that have come about due to smugglers' stories. Marriott refers to a hollow depth about which the owner knows nothing. Now, in fact, a previous tenant of the property, a man named Mr. Bellamy, was involved in smuggling and had dug a deep hole under the floor of the sitting room in order to conceal goods. Poltergeist cases tend to centre, as we know, around teenagers, in particular girls, and central to this case appears to be one of the maids, the maid aged 13, whose name was Sally Case. But was she the focal point for an actual set of supernatural activities, or something which was constructed more locally? Well, we never know that for certain, but in his account of the case, the Reverend Sabin Baring-Gould, who wrote extensively on these sorts of things in Devon, says that he believed that there was a rational cause. He said, there can, I think, be little doubt that it was not Mr. Chave, but the servant maids who managed the whole series of phenomena. These knockings could easily be transmitted through boards and the curtains tossed about, and books and candlesticks flung around the room by having horsehair attached to them. That is the true secret of the poltergeist manifestations in England, France, and Germany, says Sabin Baring-Gould. Now, he was very good at blaming servants for a lot of things, it has to be said. He doesn't state any kind of motivation for why this might have happened or any evidence for what he says is the true secret of other poltergeist cases. So it's a historic case about which we can never know many details. But I'll wrap up with this one, which is a more modern case and is not very well known, but about which somebody could possibly find some more details. And this is the case of the Teignmouth poltergeist. And in 2001, London Weekend Television broadcast a series called Britain's Most Terrifying Ghost Stories on the ITV network. It was one of those types of programs which we still find today, which professed to tell real-life ghost encounters with some pretty ropey dramatization. And in one episode, and this sequence is available to watch on YouTube if you want to seek it out, a poltergeist case from Teignmouth was discussed by the woman around whom the activities centred, a 36-year-old nurse called Fiona Hutchings. Here she is in the dramatisation with her dramatised partner, because this is how you look when a poltergeist case is happening in your property. The haunting was said to take place in a property called Hawthorne Cottage. Now, it's not clear whether this is the actual name of the cottage or whether this is the pseudonym for the programme, but it definitely took place in Teignmouth between 1988 and 1993, at least according to the programme. Fiona's son had recently left home and she'd relocated from the moors to the cottage so that she could be closer to her mother. She started to renovate the property, but then felt that there was something strange about the atmosphere of the cottage. Now, after Fiona's mother sadly passes away, she met the resident of a neighbouring property, and the neighbour began to tell Fiona stories about Hawthorne Cottage. Now, in the documentary, in a talking head interview, Fiona, not dramatised Fiona, but actual Fiona, tells how the neighbour had never passed the cottage because she'd been warned against it by her own mother, who had said there were all sorts of funny goings on down there. The previous owner, she disclosed, had gone mad. Whilst gardening, Fiona dug up a number of dead cats. Now, according to her interview on the documentary, these had been mutilated and buried in the directions of the cardinal points of the compass. The documentary maker's narrative takes great pains to point out that the burying of sacrificed animals is often a part of black magic rituals. After this, there were apparently more unexplained events at the cottage, including a string of electrical problems with appliances and 2 fires. One night, Fiona reports that she wakes up and is unable to get out of bed. She believed that she saw a number of children in the bedroom, who she then realised were not real. After being unable to sleep at night for 6 months or so, Fiona called on the services of her friend Louise Barlow, who acted as a medium. Louise felt that what she termed rituals had taken place on the land where the house was built, and because of that, she brought in a qualified exorcist from the liberal Catholic Church in Exeter. And the exorcist said that the children had been sacrificed as part of a ritual which Fiona, quote, would not want to know about, end quote. After the exorcist's visit, the house appeared to become quiet. Fiona married a merchant seaman, a man called Viv, who spent periods of time away, but there appeared to be no problems. Then, more strange events began to take place, including Fiona finding her husband at the bottom of the stairs in the middle of the night with no idea of how he got there. So once again, she called on her medium friend, who told her that the haunting had started again as a direct reaction to Fiona's life having become more settled and happy. The documentary continues to explain that Fiona learned of an elusive local man who was said to be able to see ghosts and spirits and who helped in cases such as this. And his name was John Parker. Here he is in the programme. That's actual John Parker, not dramatised John Parker. He worked as a bricklayer, but he was something of the modern day equivalent of a local cunning man, such as historically the Exeter White Witch, for example. Or, if you like, although he wasn't a vicar, some of the aspects of what the conjuring parsons did. In 1993, John Parker visited the cottage, and over a period of 6 hours, he says that he battled the forces that were present there, which belonged to people who had been sacrificed for the cult to which they belonged. Eventually, he managed to send the spirits to the other side, and there were no further problems. 2 years later, Hawthorne Cottage was repossessed by the bank. Now, this poltergeist case, as described on the documentary, is an interesting one in lots of different ways. It's certainly presented on the programme in a sensationalist way, but that's rather at odds to the fact that there are no particular printed sources which refer to this case, unlike other hauntings which you might find, such as the one that I spoke about historically earlier on. You certainly expect to see something in literature on the topic now. Similarly, there seems to be a lot of reference to black magic rituals and murdered children, but I can't find anything in the historic record or in local memory which substantiates this fact. Now, it's certainly true that sacrifices have been made in that way in our past history, but that refers more to ancient or Roman history than anything more recent. It's more likely that these stories were a recent resonating of the satanic panic of the 1980s, where the ritual abuse relating to evil cults and black magic was a moral issue. We still see other remnants of this now, even down here in Devon. Buckfast Lee Church, which is the location of an unusual tomb to Squire Cable, who was one of these evil local squires who was buried with a large stone on him in an enclosed tomb with iron grating so that his spirit wouldn't rise again, according to the folklore. The church there at Buckfast Lee was destroyed by arson, and that was ascribed either to Satanists or to witches, depending on which source you go with. Pretty much every case of animal mutilation on the moors down here, Exmoor and Dartmoor, was said at one time in the press to have been the result of satanic rituals. Cox Tor on Dartmoor in 2006 was an example. A pony killing in 2015 was another example. If you go through the newspapers, there are lots of them. Now, it obviously can't be said for certain that no events like this have satanic connections, for want of a better term. They stem from a very old source, and that's one that's not just linked to the UK, but a worldwide one. So Geoffrey Victor, writing on the subject in America, for example, not long after the satanic panic took hold over there, notes that as far back as Roman times, there were stories claiming that Christians kidnapped Roman children for use in ritual sacrifice. Where this is particularly interesting here, of course, is in the discussion of the evolution of satanic cult stories as legends. And that's where we get most of the hallmarks which are demonstrated in the Teignmouth poltergeist case, for example. Satanic cult rumor stories derive primarily from a very ancient legend that tells the story of children who are kidnapped and murdered by a secret conspiracy of evil strangers who use the children's blood and body parts in religious rituals. It's a common trope. Variations of the legend are commonly elaborated with symbols of mysterious evil, graveyard robberies, and the mutilation of corpses, secret meetings of people engaged in secret rituals, strange incantations, strange symbols seen on walls, people clothed in black robes, black cats, and ritual animal sacrifices. Other elements of the Teignmouth case relate to other areas of folklore with much older roots. So cats have been used as foundation sacrifices in older properties for years to offer apotropaic protection, supernatural protection against invasion from evil. But cats are also a popular domesticated animal, and they're often buried in the garden when they naturally pass away. They would look mutilated after having been in the ground for a long time. With reference to the inability to move and ghostly children in the bedroom, these would suggest a more medical problem, such as sleep paralysis, perhaps, as a cause. It could have been exacerbated by the fact that Fiona has had a lack of sleep generally. There can be little doubt that unless the entire story has been fabricated, and of course that is a possibility, there was genuine concern from the main witnesses in the case. It's interesting to note that when problems first began, Fiona didn't appear to look to have the electrical problems investigated by a tradesperson, such as an electrician, but she rather called in a medium. That would suggest that there's a pre-existing level of belief in the unexplained, which might have influenced how the happenings were perceived. That's something that is often seen to be at work when we look at modern stories with relation to other types of paranormal television programming, for example, such as ghost hunting stories. So that's a selection of cases from this area which kind of surround Luffincott Rectory in terms of feeding into it in terms of folklore or taking from it in terms of folklore and having similar aspects in one way or another. I'll leave it there because we've covered quite a lot of ground, and I'll leave on screen for a minute there just website addresses for my podcast and for the Folklore Library and Archive, along with ways that you can contact me to complain about tonight's talk if you didn't enjoy it. And I will pass back to you, Claire. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Mark. I think everyone will agree with me. That was an absolutely fascinating talk, and I'll be amazed if you have anything in the line of complaints. I personally found it absolutely excellent. I suppose, first of all, I'm going to say to you what I said to Caroline when she gave a talk, a similar talk on Somerset a few weeks ago, and I think you're all absolutely spoiled down on the south coast of England for the most beautiful, picturesque places. And they are so important, I think, in these stories as well. They evoke a certain sense of something, and some of the pictures you showed, the rectory and things, they were amazing. Yeah, so thank you for that. I think for a lot of us paranormal enthusiasts, when we think of allegedly haunted rectories, we automatically think of Borley. But Luffincott, I think, is definitely a worthy rival for that fascination now, and I'm going to be doing some more reading into that myself. And some of the characters that you mentioned, I found them even more fascinating and intriguing than the bulls and the foisters. So yeah, that was just really enjoyable. Thank you. So we'll come to some questions in a minute because there's going to be lots of them. Can I just ask you personally, how early in your life were you aware of the story of the rectory, and how did you first hear about it?
Luffincott actually is a story that I only came across relatively recently, and that's because I've written a new book which is out this year for the University of Exeter Press, which is a new look at Devon folklore across the county in lots of different aspects. And as part of my research for that, I've been doing a lot of work in the archives of Theo Brown, which are held at the University of Exeter. I can see in the chat that people have been saying about the research that she typed up for her Devon Ghost book and that, for example. Well, all of her notes are housed in the Heritage Collections Department at the University of Exeter Library. And I spent quite a lot of time researching in there for stuff that I've done, and also because Theo is also a past recorder of folklore for the Devonshire Association. And I've got digital copies of a lot of her notes, which I've been building up over time as I've been working in there. And it was through that research that I really came across Luffincott in any detail fairly recently. It's a story that's not particularly, I mean, it's relatively well known because of the link to Frank Parker and the Conjuring Parsons, but it's not particularly included in a lot of books and things, for example, because it's not one of the big Devon cases which always get reproduced every time. Whenever you get coffee table books on ghosts in the area, you always get the same stories retold. Bury Pomeroy Castle, all these sorts of things. And it's not one that has fallen into the category of stories which we retell every time. And so therefore it's kind of fallen into obscurity quite a bit.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking, there was a story about hairy hands grabbing a motorcyclist. Was that Devon?
Yes, that's on Dartmoor. That's on the B3227, which is the road that runs across the highest point of Dartmoor. It's just outside Postbridge.
Wow, as if Dartmoor wasn't creepy enough.
If you want a deconstruction of that case, the absolute best one, which I can recommend for it, is if you listen to Monster Talk podcast, which you'll find again wherever you get to podcasts. They did a recent, really in-depth look at the Hairy Hands case, going back to all the old newspaper sources, and I sent Blake, that runs that podcast, I sent some various bits and pieces of material from my archives to help out with that episode, and he did an absolutely fantastic job of looking into that one. That's a really good place to look at the whole story behind the Hairy Hands.
When you say deconstructing, do you mean debunking in effect?
Yes, because we know, well, in some respects, yes, we know the reason for the physical phenomena that happened with regards to that story. The story relating to a pair of hairy hands which are said to grab the steering wheel or the handlebars of a motorbike and pull you off the road. The stories really go through to the last stories occur around about the 1960s, and they coincide with the time at which the camber of the road was changed. So we have a pretty good case for the physical reason for cars and vehicles to leave the road at that point. What's not such a strong case is where the motif of the hairy hands comes from, but Blake does look into that as part of his investigation too.
Okay, thank you so much. Christopher Lawson, he's going to be giving us a talk for everybody, stopping clocks, precognition time and trauma around the 1966 Aberfan disaster on May the 5th. Christopher, I think by the sounds of it, you really enjoyed this talk as well. And I'm not sure if you want to put these points to mark yourself, because you do seem to have an interest in it. So you want to know how the ghosts, tell us more about how the ghosts later appear as animals in the lore, because that's an aspect that shows up in a 200-year-old poltergeist case I've been studying with a colleague. So Christopher's very interested in that.
There's no straight answer to that one, because in many cases when ghosts are laid, for example, it's really a case of reducing the ghost and enclosing it in an object or banishing it to a faraway place. There are cases like the case of Knowles the Weaver, for example, where the ghost becomes a black dog. Normally, in terms of folklore, where something like that happens, it's often due to this idea that I mentioned right at the beginning of the talk about particular stories replacing older stories and so on. So we get black dog stories, for example, which develop because they replace a previous story where a ghost happened to be in a venue, in the location, on a road, wherever. Over time, there has been a cultural shift where stories of ghostly black dogs are more popular in terms of folklore for whatever reason, and in some cases they get ascribed to these older stories. That's not always the case, it's often the case. The 200-year-old poltergeist case in which it happens is probably a different thing entirely. So I would certainly be interested to have a look at why that might be the case in more detail. And if you want to drop me an email and send me more details of that, I'll see if I can unpick that one a bit for you.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Christopher. I hope you got that, Christopher. Sorry. Yeah, do send an email through and find out more information. When we were speaking about the iron around the barrels and the ghosts and spirits not being able to pass iron, Caroline says, is that why around Halloween they set fire to the tar barrels and throw it around to the crowd in Devon? That sounds very dangerous.
It's absolutely lethal. I've been to the Ottery St Mary tar barrels a couple of times, and yes, it really is. They now have to insure that event abroad because no British insurer will insure it anymore. I think they get their insurance from France now. It's not particularly connected to iron. That it's really just the case that that is the way that barrels are constructed. The folklore behind the tar barrels at Ottery is not necessarily connected to that. It's more connected to the aspects of kind of fire festivals at that time of year, which you would get anyway, and it developed that way. I can highly recommend going, but do stay on the fringes unless you're a good runner.
That sounds even crazier than the cheese rolling competition.
Oh, I love the cheese rolling. That's great, isn't it? Yeah, that again, don't do that. There are many things in folklore you should not do. Chasing a cheese down a large hill is certainly one of them. There's lots of footage of Ottery St Mary available online, and it is definitely, if you've not come across it, do look it up and have a look, because it's just crackers.
It's absolutely mad, isn't it? I've experienced it firsthand, because obviously the question was from myself.
Yeah.
The heat and it's so terrifying because the guys are throwing it at each other. It's on fire. It's above their heads, for those who don't know about it, and they are just running at each other. No idea where they're going because the flames are surrounding them. And obviously, at the time I went back in the 80s. I don't even think they had road closures. We were in the midst of it all.
No, they still don't. You're always in the midst of it. You either get out of the way or you're pushed out of the way. End of. Those are the only two options. And the events start earlier in the day with the children's barrels, which again are, set fire to and so on. And then the ladies' barrels, and then
fire.
Yeah. Children's barrels, and then the ladies' barrels, and then the men's barrels in the evening.
Marvellous. You're a hardy bunch down there, as we say in Ireland.
Absolutely.
Caroline also has a question that leads us on quite nicely. Have you heard of the Ottery St. Mary poltergeist?
I don't think that I can recall it off the top of my head, so do enlighten me.
Caroline?
Well, obviously, I spent a little bit of time there with my best friend's family. I'm not going to mention the name on here because it's a public setting, but
No.
There's a house just off the high street, and the auntie inherited it. But when she'd inherited it, there was already a presence in the house, and they used to have water dripping through the ceiling of one of the bedrooms. And I didn't see the water dripping, although the family were all talking about it when we went to watch the barrel rolling. And what we did experience, though, a lot of times is knocking and rapping and tapping. But they had a lot of poltergeist activity that, as far as I'm aware, it was before they inherited the house and afterwards as well.
And is that something that's ever really been publicised, Caroline?
Locals know about it.
Okay.
It's often the case with those sort of stories that, locals know about it, but they don't get recorded anywhere else particularly.
Okay, thank you. And Ed Woods, one of our exec members as well, says the Yelmton Church and Samford Peveril are both great accounts, and some of them are some of the best Devon paranormal accounts. I just want to see, and then we come on to basically everyone saying thank you for a fantastic talk. It really was so interesting, and a lot of people have heard a little bit, I think, about some of these stories, but as Nick says, to go into the nuts and bolts of it is really interesting, and it's delightful. Thank you for that.
No, it's good to have an opportunity to do that, because when you examine these stories in terms of folklore, you can disappear into absolute rabbit holes of unpicking information, and they do take you in all sorts of strange directions. One
more thing, so Ruth says she spent a large chunk of her youth in South Devon and Exmouth, and they used to visit Ladram Bay and were told that the beach was haunted. Do you have any knowledge of this?
I don't have an account of that in my records that I can think of off the top of my head, but it's often the case that unless these stories have been collected and recorded somewhere obvious, then they're often known on a very local basis, but they don't spread much more widely. So to visit somewhere and to be told that a particular location or a particular place is haunted down here is certainly absolutely not uncommon, but it doesn't always pass on elsewhere.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much.